All right, so here we are. We're already in World War II. This is chapter 24. I'm getting pretty close to the end here. So this is going to be a long one. So luckily this is on YouTube, so you can pause it, continue it whenever you need to. But here we go, World War II. So remember that when we talked about World War I, we said that it was important that you understood how World War I ended in the Treaty of Versailles to understand the start of World War II. And that's very true. So if you don't remember anything about that, you might want to go back and look at the last couple of slides of our World War I lecture. So the 1930s going into the 1940s were very much trying times, and that's also important to understanding why we had World War II. We have a global economic crisis that's going on. So it's important to know that the Great Depression was not limited to the United States. It was a global economic crisis, and it put a lot of stress on many different nations. This is then, in turn, going to, in part, lead to a global war. It is the deadliest and most destructive war of modern times. It resulted in 8 million lives lost through warfare, the horrors of the Holocaust, civilians being caught up in the crossfires, civilians dying due to starvation and disease. And again, we have to remember that civilian lives are lost in war because we're largely removed from war being fought on our soil.
Also remember that after World War I, we had rejected the idea of collective security. We did not join the League of Nations. That was something that the United States had rejected. We had rejected the Treaty of Versailles in general and had to make a separate peace treaty with Germany. But despite that, we're still not completely isolated. Okay, so there are two theaters in World War II, as you may or may not know. We have the war in the Pacific and we have the war in Europe. Some historians actually consider the war in the Pacific to be something that is separate from World War II just because it started so much earlier than like what we would consider the start of World War II in Europe, which would be in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. So 10 years before Pearl Harbor even happens, which happens in 1941, on September 18th of 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria, which I put a map of where Manchuria is. It's in northern China here. At the time, there was no centralized Chinese army. Therefore, they were very weak. And so this opened them up to an invasion by the Japanese. Now, they stopped there for a time. There is going to be no full invasion of the whole of China for another 3 years, but that will happen. Again, hostilities break out in the Pacific with this invasion all the way back in 1931, which is why, again, historians sometimes consider this to be separate from the rest of World War II. So what's going on in Japan? In Japan at this time, there's a lot of factionalism going on politically due to a bad economy. Again, the economy is bad globally, and it's putting strain on a lot of different nations. And so there are questions that the people of Japan are facing. Should they modernize or should they focus on international cooperation, looking to push colonial powers out of Asia? The colonial powers being mainly different European countries. Should they focus on military triumphs or should they focus on a moderate civilian government? And I think you know anything about World War II, you know that the militarism is going to win out in the end. And there's going to be a period of very aggressive military expansion in Japan. So knowing this, and because Manchuria was invaded, the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek is going to appeal to the United States for aid. The United States is going to issue the Stimson Doctrine, in which it refuses to recognize any state that is going to be created by Japanese aggression. The League of Nations also is going to condemn Japanese actions in their invasion of Manchuria. And Japan, in response, just withdraws from the League of Nations. And that's something you're going to see a lot of when we talk about different nations different nations expanding and using aggressive use of force, which is, of course, outlawed by the League of Nations and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There's going to be a lot of condemnation and a lot of action. So again, there is going to eventually be a full-scale invasion of China, which is going to be launched on July 7, 1937. Beijing falls on August 8th. Nanking, then the capital, falls on December 13th. And in the process of this fall, there are 30,000 men, women, and children killed, and thousands more women are raped. And that's why it's often referred to as the rape of Nanking, like literally and figuratively. This is occurring in China. And once again, the U.S. is going to denounce these actions, but not take any action themselves. So again, you're going to see a lot of international condemnation and not a lot of action for these different acts. Again, you can imagine why. We've just come out of World War I not too long ago. We're in the midst of a global depression. People feeling that they're not in any place to act directly on. So going over to the European side of the war, we know that there are going to be a rise of a lot of dictators throughout the world, not just in Europe, but in Japan as well. So you have Mussolini in Italy, and you have Hitler, of course, in Germany. And they're able to emerge out of the chaos of the Depression and the end of World War I. And they're able to seize power, hitting on the promises of that restoration of national pride, which, of course, had taken a hit in World War I, and focusing first on Benito Mussolini, who is going to be the fascist dictator of Italy. Actually comes to power prior to Hitler. So Italy had a fascist government before the fascists actually take over in Germany. He promotes himself by hitting on the theme of resurrecting the glories of ancient Rome, focusing on gaining a colonial Italian empire, which in this case, they wanted to focus specifically on Africa. And to that end, they invaded Ethiopia in 1935. So again, this is going to test the League of Nations idea of collective security. Okay, so we have this aggressive use of force. What are we going to do? And again, once again, the League of Nations is going to condemn this action, but not do anything. Switching gears to talk about Spain. So the Spanish Civil War is going to start in 1936. So a civil war is not something that is limited to the United States. A civil war can happen anywhere. It's anytime you have a country that is fighting itself. You have people who are fighting within their country. That's a civil war. And in this case, you had the Spanish fascists led by their dictator, Francisco Franco, who are fighting against the Communist Republican Party in Spain. And a lot of people consider this Spanish Civil War to be like the prelude to World War II, because you have the armies of fascists fighting against non-fascist governments, and at least for Hitler and Mussolini, it's their opportunity to test out some different techniques, some different weapons before World War II even breaks out, because Hitler and Mussolini come together to help out their brother fascist, Franco, and they send him, weapons, advisors, etc. And again, it's a way for them to kind of test out different ideas, and also to see what is the rest of the world going to do. Are they going to let the fascists take over, or are they going to help prevent that? And though Great Britain and France are wary of what's going on and building up their own military back home, they don't actually intervene. And in the end, the fascists win. So again, it's a way for Hitler and Mussolini to kind of test, how far can we take this? How far is the rest of the world going to let fascism take over in various countries before they actually intervene? And moving along to Hitler, somebody that you are probably, unfortunately, very familiar with. Adolf Hitler is going to be the fascist dictator of Germany. And the League's inaction to do anything with Italy and to do anything with really any other aggressive use of force throughout Europe and the Pacific inspires him to take action. And so his motivation is outlined in his very famous book known as Mein Kampf, or Mein Struggle. And Mein Kampf calls for the unification of all people of German descent and the need for what he called living space. So meaning bringing people who were of German descent living in what would then be other countries and giving them more room to literally live. And so in order for them to have more living space, they need to gain more land. And he's going to be largely focused on Eastern Europe here. And obviously, if you need more space, but people are already living there, then you need to kick them out. And what he called lesser humans would have to go to make way for people of German descent, which he again wants to see united. So remember, when we talk about Europe, the borders of what was or is certain countries have shifted over time. So you do have people who are largely of German descent living in Poland or living in other regions because maybe what was once Poland wasn't always Poland. So he's hoping to reunite these people and again push other people out of other regions of Eastern Europe to make room for. To that end, in 1936, he sends troops to the Rhineland. The Rhineland was a former German territory, again, borders changed, that had been lost as a result of World War I. It was demilitarized, and he sends troops there. This was a huge loss for the Germans after World War I, and it was a really sore spot for them. So it's not a surprise that he sends troops there first. In 1938, he sends troops to the Sudetenland, which is an ethnically German area of Czechoslovakia in Eastern Europe. So after he sends troops there, there is a meeting in the city of Munich in which Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to meet along with the Prime Minister of France, and they meet with Hitler to discuss what's going on. And they actually agree at this conference to give the Sudetenland, this part of Czechoslovakia, to Germany. So essentially, they're rewarding him for going in and invading another country. So there's different ways to look at this. Number one, you're giving somebody who is obviously an evil person what he wants. You're giving into his demands. If you look at the Dr. Seuss cartoon over there to the right, yes, he made a series of political cartoons in World War II. You see the octopus, which is clearly, with the swastikas on it, clearly meant to represent Adolf Hitler, being pacified by a figure which is meant to represent Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain. And he's playing the violin for him, like he's pacifying him. So you have that end, but then you also have to remember we're not that far from World War I. We're experiencing a very difficult time economically. Nobody wants another war, and their hope was this is going to be a way in which we stop Hitler. We're going to just give him what he wants, and he's going to stop. And we know that doesn't happen. Not surprisingly, Hitler then just takes the Sudetenland and invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. So that didn't work. Again, we know that because we know what's going to happen. They didn't have that benefit at the time. And then he starts to make threatening moves and threaten Poland. And Britain and France this time promise action, that if Hitler is going to invade Poland, they're actually going to do something. They're not just going to condemn his actions, or they're not going to give in to him this time. So before he does that, he does a surprise move, and he signs the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act with the Soviet Union. And this is surprising because Hitler had long denounced the Soviet Union as one of the main enemies of Germany. This is because he hated communism. Again, he is a fascist. He hated communism. It's not a political ideology that jives well with fascism. And he also thought that all communists were Jews and all Jews were communists. And we know his feelings for the Jewish people are very well known. And so it was surprising to a lot of people that he would sign this act with the Soviet Union, then a communist nation. In it, they agreed to split Poland between the two of them, and they agreed to have a non-aggression pact between. But remember, It does make sense if you think about it, because strategically, what is he trying to avoid here? He's trying to avoid fighting a war on two fronts. Remember what happened in World War I, in which the Germans were fighting Great Britain and France on the Western Front, and also what was then Russia on the Eastern Front, now the Soviet Union. So by signing this, that's what he's hoping to do. Now, this is not going to last. Again, we know this because we know what's going to happen throughout World War II, but that was the purpose in signing it then. So there is an invasion. These are the main powers that are going to be fighting during World War II. You have the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan fighting against the Allies, Great Britain, France, eventually the Soviet Union, and eventually us, which of course we're going to talk about as we go through this. All right, so the goal of the German army strategically is that they want to avoid the stalemate that happened in World War I. And we talked about that quite a bit, so if you don't remember, maybe go back and revisit that. But World War I was largely a stationary war. Think about the trenches and the fact that not a whole lot of land was taken one way or the other, and they were bogged down in these trenches for a great majority of the war. So to that end, he is going to build up a new army that is built specifically for speed and maneuverability. They're going to use planes, tanks, and motorized infantry. They're going to concentrate their forces, smash front lines, and wreak havoc behind defenses. And they call this strategy very famously blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. So again, focusing on maneuverability. So in between Great Britain and France declaring war on Germany, there is a 6-month lull in the fighting where nothing happens. And so people actually start referring to it as the phony war. Like, what's going on? Why isn't Hitler doing anything? Why isn't there any action? And eventually that does end. In May of 1940, Germany launches their army at what was then the neutral Netherlands and Belgium. And what are they doing? They are on their way to France. By June, France is completely defeated, and they are split in two. The Germans outright control the northern part of France. There is supposedly this free zone to the south. It's called the Vichy government, was in control there. But the Vichy government was ruling, quote unquote, with the Germans, meaning the Vichy government was they were puppets of the Germans. So really the Germans controlled, in actuality, all of France. But using blitzkrieg. So that just leaves Great Britain, at least in Europe. They're the only ones left to fight off Germany. And so Operation Sea Lion was the planned invasion of the British Isles. I always shock people every year by saying Great Britain is it's an island. A lot of people don't know that. The English Channel separates Great Britain, which includes England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. It separates the British Isles from the mainland part of Europe. And so Operation Sea Lion was the planned land invasion of the British Isles. But before they do that, they need to establish air superiority over the English Channel to clear the way for a land invasion. To that end, between June and October, the German Luftwaffe are going to be engaged in a series of battles with the Royal Air Force, or the RAF. And the British pilots are able to hold out. They win, as it's called, the Battle of Britain, and they're able to hold off this land invasion of. And if you've ever seen the Chronicles of Narnia, that's actually depicted in that. That's usually where people know it from. If the air raid sirens went off, you had to try to seek shelter in maybe a shelter nearby, a basement. Subways were often centers of refuge during the bombing. This does end in June of 1941, and if you've seen those famous Keep Calm and Carry On posters, that's where they originate. They originate in the Blitz, which again is the bombing campaign against British. Okay, so again, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act, this non-aggression act between the Soviet Union and Germany, is not going to last long. The purpose is to try to defeat France and Great Britain and then deal with Russia. Well, Great Britain, we know, holds out, and that was not expected. And so the Germans go ahead and start the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was called Operation Barbarossa. Now, the purpose of this was to gain access, very important, to the agricultural fields and the oil fields in the Soviet Union. A lot of World War II strategically is centered around oil, because oil, of course, is necessary to run the machines necessary for war, your tanks, your planes, etc. And so access to strategic oil fields is going to be the focus of a lot of these battles. We're not going to get into too many specific battles, but if you're interested in that military side of things and you start looking into it, you'll see that that's the focus for a lot of important battles. The Battle of Stalingrad, for instance, El Alamein. However, Russia, people don't study their history, and this is what happens. As was the case with many other attempted invasions of Russia, they are too big, and in this case, way too willing to sacrifice millions of lives to stop the Germans. And the Germans are stopped. They have to fall back outside of Moscow. Okay, so that's where we're at in Europe. Again, we're not going to get into a lot of the battles, especially the ones in which we are not directly involved in. If you're interested in it and you go further in your study of history, you can take classes that are more specifically focused on those things. We're just getting a wide lens view of American history in this course. It's a survey course. So unfortunately, we don't get to get into a lot of different specifics. So where are we? We are trying to remain isolated. A lot of isolationists want to keep the United States out of the war. And there's a lot of hard feelings about World War I. And a lot of that comes from, or can be seen in this Nye Committee. So in 1934, Senator Gerald P. Nye from North Dakota decided to investigate munitions dealers. And he concluded that America was tricked into war by munitions dealer. Now, that was his conclusion, but it represents a lot of harsh feelings that people had about World War I, feeling that we shouldn't have been involved. And a lot of people continue to feel that way now. Problems abroad are not our problem. We should, keep our nose out of it. A lot of people have that feeling towards military engagements abroad, and it was no different prior to World War. So we are going to pass a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937. And there's 3 different neutrality acts. And again, big picture, essentially what they do is they ban loans and the sale of arms to nations at war. Of course, again, when I say arms, I mean like weapons. I don't mean actual arms. And they warn Americans not to take ships to countries of war, remembering what happened in World War I, in which ships carrying American passengers were sunk by German submarines. Needed to become very scarce. So on December 29th of 1940, FDR has one of his famous fireside chats in which he explains the need to help Great Britain. And so the Lend-Lease Act is passed in March of 1941, and it states that we can send war materials to any countries whose defense is deemed to be vital to the U.S., and in this case, that meant Great Britain. So we were helping out Great Britain to a certain extent prior to us officially entering the war from the United States. So clearly that's going to be a problem for them because they need oil and iron to fight a war. So Japan is in a position in which they are forced to either give in and leave China and the Indochina Peninsula or attack the United States. And we all know what they chose to do. They focus on our fleet at Pearl Harbor and the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. In late November of 1941, a Japanese fleet is going to enter the North Pacific. There are 6 aircraft carriers in this fleet and 400 planes. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, the day which will live in infamy, you should probably know that date, hint, hint, there are going to be 3 waves of attacks on our fleet in the Pacific in Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasts 2 hours. It damages 18 ships, takes the lives of 2,403 men. And the next day, December 8th, Roosevelt very famously asked Congress for a declaration of war, which is granted. So we declare war on Japan, and in response, Germany and Italy, as Japan's allies, declared World War II. Now, initially, American anger is directed at Japan. It's not surprising there. They are the ones who attacked us unprovoked, and so that's where our anger is going to be focusing. Roosevelt, however, recognizes Hitler as a bigger threat. Some reports of what was going on in Germany and their treatments of the Jews are trickling into the United States and the rest of the world, but a lot of people didn't believe it. And that's going to be a big problem for Roosevelt to convince people that these things are actually happening. I mean, even in Europe, these things were so, the horrors of the Holocaust were so overwhelming for people, and I think they're so overwhelming for us now that a lot of people are like, no, that can't be true. Like, stuff like that doesn't happen. But Roosevelt recognizes what's happening, and he realizes that Hitler needs to be his number one priority. And so that's where our focus is going to be. We get a slow start. Our war begins very slowly, very similar to World War I. Just remember, Britain is all alone here. And so similar to World War I, American supplies are going to be very important to bolster the people and the armed forces of Great Britain. And again, very similar to World War I, we are going to focus on protecting them from German U-boats. So these U-boat, quote unquote, wolf packs are going to be unleashed by Hitler, and they're just attacking anything and everything they can. Unrestricted submarine warfare once again. And so that's where we're going to be focusing on first in this Battle of the Atlantic. But because of our and Great Britain's superior tactics, we are able to defeat Germany. And a lot of that is because British code breakers were actually able to crack the radio code used by the Germans, known as Ultra. Roosevelt that we should focus next on Italy, as he called it, the soft underbelly of Europe. But before we get into that, we'll talk about the bombing of Germany. So it's difficult to talk about like the narrative of World War II because we kind of have to hop around. Things are happening simultaneously. There's things going on in North Africa. Then there's this bombing of Germany, and there's things going on in the Pacific. So again, these things are happening simultaneously, and obviously I can't talk about it at once. So just keep this in mind. So the Army Air Force in England is going to start their massive bombing attack in Germany. It's kind of like our answer to the Blitz, which happened in Great Britain. And it's going to be a constant bombing attack on cities in Germany. So our forces are going to attack German industries by day, and the Royal Air Force is going to attack German cities by night. And so, again, this is going to be just a constant bombardment of the German nations, focusing on centers of industry that are going to hurt their war effort, that are producing weapons and whatnot for their armies. We want to bomb those so that they can't get needed supplies. And these attacks are going to be more successful when long-range escort fighters are used. As you can see, the large bombers over there in the picture to the right, escorted by fighter planes to fight off any enemy planes hoping to. The Nazis refused to give in, even though officially Italy is going to make peace. They're going to rush new troops there and fight all the way to the end on the Italian peninsula. In fact, northern Italy is going to be just complete chaos. The liberation of France to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, because again, he's kind of on his own on the Eastern Front fighting the Germans there. And so the planned liberation of France is going to start D-Day, and they are supposedly, by people who actually survived D-Day, soldiers that fought there, supposedly the most accurate depiction of D-Day. So go ahead and look up, opening D-Day, Saving Private Ryan on YouTube, and it'll give you an idea of what we're talking about here. But it is successful. So as a result, Germany is now starting to crumble on both fronts. Think about it. The Allies are coming up from the south to the north in Italy. They are moving in from the west. They're liberating France. And so the Soviets are also pushing in from the east. So they're just being pushed on all fronts, and they're starting to crumble. And so the very famous Battle of the Bulge is their last chance to try to drive the Allies back. And it's not a success for them. They give it their all. It's a very bloody battle, but they are unsuccessful. Again, the Soviets are pushing in on their western front. The big three are going to meet again at Yalta to discuss Hitler's surrender and their plans for how Europe is going to look after the war, which we'll get into that in the next chapter. The capital of Berlin is going to be taken in May by the Soviets, not the Americans. Hitler and the high command are going to commit suicide in the bunker, and you've probably heard all sorts of different conspiracy theories that like Hitler didn't really commit suicide. He escaped. He was living in South America, which a lot of Nazi officers did escape to live in South America. And a lot of the source of these conspiracy theories are the fact that the Soviets took Berlin and found his body and burned it so that his burial place wouldn't be like a shrine to neo-Nazis. I don't believe it, but you want to go down that rabbit hole, more power to you. And so this is considered VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. The big three are going to meet once again at Potsdam, in which they agree to divide Germany and the capital city of Berlin itself into different zones. And again, we'll get more into that in our next chapter on the Cold War when we talk about a little bit more about it. Okay, so now we need to talk about the Pacific Theater. Now that Hitler has been defeated in Europe, more focus can be given on the Pacific Theater. So again, it's hard because we're fighting in the Pacific at the same time we're fighting in Europe, but it would be really hard to like flip-flop slides back and forth between Europe, the Pacific, Europe, the Pacific. So I just chose to do all of Europe at once and now the Pacific at once, but know that it's going on at the same time. Okay. So the war in the Pacific starts slowly, also, as well as it did in Europe. And again, our full attention is mainly focused on defeating Hitler first. The Philippines actually fall to Japan following Pearl Harbor. The garrison there surrenders, and all the soldiers there are forced on what is now known as the Bataan Death March. They are marched 80 miles to a POW camp in which they are given no food, no water, and no rest. If they fell behind, they were shot. They were out in the sun. Again, marching 80 miles with no food, water, or rest is very harsh, and very few people actually made it. Japan's Pacific naval operations. And then we start the strategy of island hopping, which is where we attack island after island, bypassing the strong, but seizing those capable of holding airfields. Because, of course, strategically speaking, at the time we did not have the ability to launch aerial attacks from the United States all the way, bomb Japan, turn around, come back. We didn't have that ability. And so having airfields on these little islands, again, looking over at the map on the right, is strategically important for having. The combat in the Pacific is very vicious. The Japanese were known for their tenacity. They refused to be taken or to take prisoners. They saw surrender as highly embarrassing to them in their culture. And so, for example, they had these suicide chargers known as kamikazes that they would use rather than surrendering at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Again, they refused to take or be taken as prisoners. You also, on the other side, see a lot of racial prejudice from the United States towards the Japanese nations. And so a lot of people consider the Pacific to be more brutal than the European theater for these regions. So to kind of illuminate that, at the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is an island that is 8 square miles, 17,000 Japanese are able to hold off 70,000 Marines for over a month. And that gives you an idea of the tenacity of the Japanese forces, and that's going to come into play here when we talk about the atomic weapons in a minute. By February of 1945, we have gained enough strategic islands that we are able to bomb mainland Japan. We use incendiary weapons. A lot of the buildings in Japan were built of wood, and so incendiary weapons obviously causing fires and a lot of destruction. And because of this, 100,000 civilians were killed in Tokyo in March of 1945. In June, the island of Okinawa is captured. Okinawa, you can see on the map over to the right, very close to mainland Japan. And Okinawa is able to provide us for a viable base for a full-scale invasion of Japan. Launching an invasion similar to what we did on D-Day in northern France. So again, keep that in mind in a second. That we're not willing to lose. So the atomic bomb was developed through throughout the Manhattan Project, which was headed by Robert J. Oppenheimer, in which they were able to harness the atomic energy in a single weapon. It was first tested in New Mexico in July of 1945, proving that it worked. And again, it was decided to be used in Japan at this point. 2 bombs were dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, in which 100,000 civilian lives were lost, and Nagasaki on August 9th, in which 80,000 civilian lives were lost. Japan was warned that these bombs were going to be used. They are new weaponry, however, so I don't think anybody really knew the full-scale devastation that would be caused, and also the lives that would be lost later on due to exposure to radiation. But it does work. Japan surrenders on August 15th, and the World War II then is officially over. So here's a quote that I think illuminates the controversy surrounding atomic weapons. Robert Oppenheimer, who headed the Manhattan Project, quoted this Hindu scripture: "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds." And he quoted this when he saw that test bomb go off in New Mexico. Which leads to our first chapter question, very controversial one, really popular one for the second short response, which is, was the United States justified in dropping the atomic bombs? Okay, so we talked about the battles. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some domestic issues before we wrap up this discussion of World War II. On the home front, the government is going to take control of the economy for the duration of the war. The War Production Board is the agency put in charge of the economy, and it is their job to convert factories from making whatever it was they were making before to making military goods. And the military demand is great. And so because of this, unemployment goes way, way down, production goes way, way up, the Depression is over. And again, that's where people question the success of the New Deal and whether or not it was successful in helping us get out of the Great Depression, because officially we are brought out of the Great Depression by our entry. Because factories are now producing mainly for the war effort, consumer goods become scarce and there has to be rationing. So rationing is something that we can kind of, I guess, relate to at this point, because goods are scarce now due to our fears survive and our need to shelter in place due to coronavirus. But in this case, the government was actually limiting the amount of goods you could buy. And so what that meant is that you had these ration books, and these ration books would give you coupons, not the kind of coupons that we think of, like 15% off this item. It's coupons as like, you need X amount of coupons to buy the good. Like, you also had to pay for it, but you needed the coupons because that's how they limited how much certain people could buy. So you don't have the coupons, you don't have the products. Like, let's say it takes 8 coupons to buy flour at the store and you've already used your 8 coupons, but you need more flour. Too bad. You can't buy anymore. So because of this, Americans were encouraged to grow their own food. A lot of people planted what were called victory gardens because of that. And the government paid for. The war opened up many opportunities for women as well. 5 million women are going to join the workforce. The song Rosie the Riveter celebrated women working in factories, and Rosie the Riveter actually became a nickname for women who were performing industrial work. And Rosie herself, picture over there on the right, became a symbol of patriotism and the determination of the American women on the home front. And more on what happens after the war is going to come in our next lecture concerning women's. Last segregated war, Korea, which is our next war, is going to be the first war in which the troops are desegregated. They were segregated in World War II. 1 million African Americans will serve in segregated units, and an additional million African Americans are going to continue that great migration from the South to the North to work in factories producing for the war effort. And because of this segregation, A. Philip Randolph actually planned a march on Washington to protest continued discrimination despite the patriotism shown by African American soldiers. So there was actually going to be a march on Washington, like prior to the March on Washington that was organized in the Civil Rights Movement. And both Roosevelt's, Eleanor and FDR, came together to issue an executive order banning discrimination in defense and government agencies to try to head off any kind of protest domestically, because they don't want a lot of domestic unrest going on at the same time that we're fighting in a war. And they put in place fair employment practices with a commission to monitor and to try to enforce that. But for African Americans hoping for civil rights, they focused on what they called the Double V campaign: victory over fascism in Europe and victory over discrimination at home, hoping that what didn't happen in World War I is going to happen in World War II, that when the American soldiers come home having fought with distinction, they will be able to achieve civil rights as well. And we know that that unfortunately doesn't happen. Native Americans also served in the war in large numbers, 44,000 out of a total of 350,000, so that's 10% of all Native Americans served in World War II. 40,000, an additional 40,000 are going to leave reservations to work in war industries. The most famous of those serving are the Navajo Native Americans who served as code talkers. They were recruited by the Marines to use their language as code, because it was code that could not be broken by the enemy in the Pacific, because what is the likelihood that there's somebody who speaks Navajo living in Japan? Zero. And so that is how they were able to gain success in a large. Focusing on the Hispanic experience, there were 3 million Mexican Americans living in the United States at this time. And their youth culture included this zoot suit. So this zoot suit was like this long coat that they would wear with these like really baggy trousers. But at the time, we know that there was rationing going on, and rationing included fabric. Fabric was rationed. So there was a shortage of wool and rayon, which restricted the yardage in clothing. Like, people had to make do with less material. And this effectively forbid zoot suits from happening. But bootleg tailors continued to make, and a lot of people saw this as an example of unpatriotism, that these Mexican Americans were continuing to wear this zoot suit. And a lot of soldiers stationed in Los Angeles resented this, and they accused the Mexican American youths who were wearing zoot suits of unpatriotic activities. And this resulted in what was known as the zoot suit riots, which lasted for 7 Japanese internment that occurred. So a lot of very frightened and very angry Americans on the West Coast following Pearl Harbor are going to vent their rage against the people of Japan and people of Japanese descent living in America. And the Army insists that an evacuation of Japanese Americans is a necessary precaution for safety purposes. So on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which is the military evacuation of all people of Japanese descent living on the West Coast of the United States. A total of 110,000 Japanese Americans were confined in 10 detention camps, which were located on very isolated federal lands in the western part of the nation. So these are people. Here's another Dr. Seuss cartoon underscoring people's fear that people who were of Japanese descent living in America would in some way be spying for the Japanese. Here's another image of a woman who is obviously venting her rage against Japanese using a very racially charged term and case. And they argued that the Japanese were deprived of their life, liberty, and property without due process. But the Supreme Court actually upheld Executive Order 9066, citing the fact that it was the gravest imminent danger to public safety. So it's very similar to Schenck versus the United States, that your rights, as outlined by the Constitution, can be curtailed in times of national security. And so that is what was stated here. To our last chapter question, which again is another very popular one for people to use for their essay, and that was the United States justified in issuing Executive Order 9066?